Now ready for a discussion of zoning code updates. Mrs. Dolworth.
Thank you, Your Honor, members of council and planning commission members. The city's current zoning code has been in place since 1953 with multiple revisions and updates over the years. In order for the zoning code to be aligned with the Sidney Comprehensive Plan and be in line with current innovations and also organize regulations in a manner that's easy for citizens to understand, the city's been working with Suder of ZoneCo to rewrite the code. Tonight we're presenting the first draft of this code. This is intended to be a working document and is presented as such, and then there will be a time period for public comments, revisions, etc. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Mr. Suder. He is going to go through the rough draft and point out the highlights of the organization and so on. With that, Mr. Suder.
Thank you, everyone. Do you need my camera on, or am I good? Just how are we doing that?
You're good without your camera.
Okay.
Don't Perfect. Typically allow webcam sharing.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, hopefully you can hear me then. Mr. Mayor, members of council, and the commission, thank you so much for having me out this evening to present to you the work that we've been doing with Ms. Dolworth and her staff, and with the steering committee that's been seated of members of the public to give us feedback, to get you to the point here where we have a very first preliminary draft, something to start looking at relative to a modern zoning code for Sidney's tomorrow. Okay, let's see if I can advance this. There we go. So to let you know where we've been, where we are on the project, the first step in any zoning code rewrite project is to know where you are, know whether your existing code is advancing your community's vision, or if it's serving as a barrier, or doing both, or doing neither. So we have to go line by line, which we did in 2019, line by line through your existing zoning code, and rate it against the benchmarks in your comprehensive plan. And what we found was no surprise. It obviously does not advance the comprehensive plan goals for the city, and some things need to be tweaked and modified, and some things need to be amended to do that. We then draft a menu of districts and zones. We take a look at the map. We say, okay, which zones are working, which zones maybe need consolidation with other zones, which zones do we need to create new zones for, and we create a menu of zones and districts that reflect the desired development patterns in the city and the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. And then we put together draft standards for each district and zone. So, and we calibrate those specifically to the vision and the desired development outcomes in each of those zones. And here we are with a first draft of a code book for the public workshop. This is not a stylized or formatted draft at this point. We're just trying to get your input and feedback on the content. We'll get to the style and the graphics and all that, and get that all tidied up at a later time. But you can start seeing it coming together in this first draft. We want to make sure we have the content in a good space before we get all the fancy style and everything put together. But throughout the process, we've been meeting with the steering committee, a group of engaged citizens who have given us specific feedback along the way. And now we're here for your start of your input and feedback on the draft. Okay, so the vision versus the regulations. What you said you wanted, very important in the comprehensive plan to understand what the community is trying to achieve. And so you can see on the left there the vision for the community and your comprehensive plan. And then we did the diagnostic report in September 2019 that, like I said, reviewed it, your current code against those benchmarks. And we found overall that it's not an easy code to use, no surprise. You know, most codes from the 1950s that have been sort of piecemeal updated over time tend to get a little messy because and disjointed because you're adding language in. A lot of times the language doesn't match the current language exactly, and the definitions start getting a little sloppy, et cetera, et cetera. Also, current and modern codes, like I said, incorporate graphics and tables and diagrams and charts along with words, just to make it easier to use and to administer. And so all of that is lacking in your current code, and those are things that we can help you get right. There were two goals in your comprehensive plan that are focused specifically on land use and are influencing the zoning code rewrite. One is the goal of the city to promote infill and mixed use development in the downtown and the surrounding neighborhoods. The scoring showed that this code really wasn't doing much to accomplish that. There were some current provisions and regulations around the Court Square district that are doing that, but generally speaking, the area surrounding the downtown for zoning purposes is treated like a lot of other parts of the city, even though it has a distinct development pattern from other parts of the city. So we responded to this by taking a look at your zoning map, and we proposed to create a new Court Square district. That is a district around your historic downtown Court Square district that would contain all of the development regulations for that area in one easy to use district. And then we took a look at the surrounding neighborhoods. There is a distinct development pattern around the downtown. That's the older part of the city, smaller lots, a more urban residential form, and we propose grouping that all together into a traditional neighborhood development pattern because that has unique needs and circumstances, and really focus on allowing for those unique development patterns to exist and to continue to infill and redevelop in those unique parts of the city. Then your plan also called for a number of growth areas, 4 to be exact, and we wanted to make sure we got the zoning right in those areas, as they seem to be areas of opportunity that you've identified. Plan area 1 is an area south of Campbell Road to the city's corporate limits. That's an industrial section. There's not a whole lot to be done there from a zoning standpoint, except to make sure that the standards are getting the type of development and the taking advantage of that opportunity for economic development in that area. Plan area 2 is north of Leeson to Russell. Again, this is an industrial area of opportunity for growth and development north of town. So we just want to make sure that we're getting that right on the zoning map. And then plan area 3, again, around the interchange. This area is slated for mixed use development. There's a large tract there that could be used for a multifamily housing development or some mixed use development with housing and commerce. And then plan area 4 is an interesting area. It's the area that's focused mostly probably on redevelopment and infill development. That's east of Wapakoneta Avenue and south of East Mason Road, where you see a mix of residential and neighborhood commercial. This is a small lot. It's distinguishable from the commercial out by the interstate. This is much older, and we have a lot of property lines there to deal with, so a different condition there. So what we have come up with from a zoning map standpoint is hopefully a simpler, more consolidated group of zones that reflect the development patterns of the city and reflect the desired development that you're looking for, and that's reflected in your plan. So if you look at the proposed zoning map, you'll be familiar with the R1 residential single unit. That is what it is today, so that's not really changing. The R2 residential attached unit, that's going to be your duplexes, and then your R3 residential multifamily unit. Those are areas where you might have a some sort of a stacked flat or apartment type development, and you can see those in the darker orange. Then you have the traditional neighborhood we discussed around the downtown and Court Square. We added a new type of zone called neighborhood commerce. This is a smaller scale commerce. If you think about the different types of commerce you have, corridor commerce, and that's the larger scale, big box type retail, shopping centers, that kind of stuff, out by the interstates and on the main thoroughfares. But then you also have, this finely knitted, smaller type neighborhood commerce in the older sections of the city typically. And there's a real opportunity there, we think, for creating some walkable amenities for your neighborhoods, creating some infill development, and creating some opportunity for some more walkable, like I said, walkable commercial amenities to go along with the residential neighborhoods. Then you have your corridor commerce we talked about. It's your larger scale commerce, along the interstates and interchanges and major thoroughfares. And then, of course, the Court Square district downtown. And then the purplish, bluish purple there, that would be a new zone called Industry Innovation Manufacturing, IMM. And we can talk more about all of this, but just wanted to get you oriented with our proposed changes to the zoning map. This is the table of contents, that you see reflected in your draft code. The idea here is to make it easy to use as possible, to make it intuitive. So you start out like you would any other text with an introduction and really how to use the ordinance, just kind of setting everything up. How do I measure? How do I, get to my answer? What can I do with my property, right? That's the question everybody wants to know. So we start out there and then get into the zones, hopefully make those as simple as possible, 1 or 2 pages, probably 2 pages each, so that, if I have property in one of those zones, I can go and look up in those 2 pages and know pretty much everything I need to know about using my property in that zone. And then get into other more generally applicable type standards, whether it be landscaping or signage, parking, those things that are going to apply across zones. And then some of your legal provisions, nonconformities, and administration. How do I get a variance? What happens if I want to do a zone change, or those kinds of questions. And then at the end, a really nice consolidated glossary. So all the terms that I might find in the other chapters, I can go back to that glossary and find them, and they'd be defined precisely, so there aren't any ambiguities. So real quick on the Sidney residential zones, you see the current on the left is the current list of zones. There's a suburban residence. Well, there's also this N1 zone, the non-urban residence, but that doesn't appear, I don't believe, on the map anywhere. So we figured if we weren't using it, we would just eliminate that. But the S1 suburban residence and the R1, 2, and 3, essentially the S1 and the R1 are fairly indistinguishable. And so for simplification purposes, it seemed appropriate to combine those into one, the R1 residential single unit zone. The R2, like I said, can be their duplexes, R3s, your multifamily, and then TND traditional neighborhoods. So we've taken five zones there and combined, consolidated them into 4. It's a step in the right direction. You can see just as you go through the code, your R1 is your standard suburban style. It's your standard zone in Sydney for residential. It's a 6,600 square foot lot minimum with a 60-foot wide lot. And you can see the different standards, fairly traditional type residential. R2 gets a little bit larger. It's an 8,000 square foot lot. For reference, 43,560 is the area of 1 acre. 43,560 square feet is the area of 1 acre. So that's what, 1/5 roughly of an acre, that R2. Same lot width, and if you're doing any kind of multi-unit, it'd be 4 acres to the, 4 units to the acre maximum there. The R3 gets even larger. So this is essentially a 1/3 of an acre, 1/4 acre type lot. And and this one's going to have more, a larger lot because it's going to hold a multifamily building of some sort of multifamily unit, and see minimum of 3 units per acre and a maximum of 12 units per acre. Fairly low density multifamily, but it does allow for that housing option at a density of 12 units per acre. TND's going to be much smaller lot size. The TND is a much smaller lot, 4,000 square feet. That's going to reflect the condition around the downtown. So much smaller lot, 30 feet wide, with a maximum of 60 feet. And there we're trying to reflect the 19-teens, 1920s condition around the downtown. And then we have a list of business zones. The business zones right now, you have O1 office, B1 local business, B2 community business, B5 Court Square business, and then you have 2 industrial zones. So one thing we wanted to do was to name them something that is, we think, a little bit easier to understand, and that reflects the name reflects what we're trying to achieve in that zone. So, neighborhood commerce, that is what it sounds like. That is your small scale, walkable, neighborhood oriented type commercial. Corridor commerce, again, what that sounds like. It is your main thoroughfares and around the interstates. Court Square District, of course, we know what that is. And then industry, innovation, and manufacturing. The industrial zones you have currently were, again, relatively indistinguishable. And industry's changed a little bit so that even heavier industry is a lot less impactful and a lot cleaner than it used to be. So, there really isn't a huge difference in what you're going to get. So we thought, let's simplify this and just combine it all into one IIM zone. So that runs through both the residential and business zones, and you can just see, and you can see this in the draft code as well, the different standards. Lot coverage is probably going to be one that you're going to want to take a hard look at when it comes to these commercial zones, to make sure that you're still leaving some open space, but you're allowing for enough commerce, obviously, to get the economic development you're looking for. And this leads us to the heart of the city, the Court Square District. There's an obvious intention to make sure that continues to be the heart and soul of your city, with maintaining the historic buildings and historic fabric, but also allowing for some redevelopment and infill. And so the biggest issue in this district is going to be building location, building placement, materials, that kind of thing. And that's what we need to calibrate, just to make sure that it reflects that historic downtown feel and scale and walkable nature of your beautiful Court Square. And that is all I have as a summary of what you have in front of you. Obviously, there's a lot more detail in the document, and we'll be going through that over the coming months and getting your input. But if you want more information, or to see drafts, or to read the diagnostic report, or find the comp plan, you can go to sydneycode.com. That's our project website. And look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Let's start with the Planning Commission. Do members of the Planning Commission have questions? And we'll start with Mrs. Miller.
No, I do not have any questions at this time.
Mrs. Dunn?
No, not at this time.
Mr. Gross?
Not at this time.
Mr. Asher?
No, nothing.
Okay, let's move on to council. Mrs. Milligan?
No questions at this time.
Mr. Raymaker?
I have no questions at this time.
Mr. Klinger?
No questions at this time.
And Mr. Wagner?
No questions at this time.
I've got just a couple. One is, when you did definitions, what was your attempt when you did those? I guess kind of the rationale between why you picked some things and not others.
Are you referring to breaking it up by uses and then general terms, or?
It's glossary of terms / uses, I guess, is the section I'm on. And I'll give you an example. Under air transportation, you've listed a heliport on page 85, something we don't currently have. And then back on page, I think it's 96, you further defined a heliport. Then when I looked at educational institutions, you kind of lumped everything from primary schools through colleges. Under that, you listed them again back on 115 under schools, but put nothing like, there was not a further definition like under a high school or anything. And that's why I wondered why it seemed like some things you spent a lot of time on, heliports, for example. And then, that was the question.
Yeah. That is sort of a working document as we move through this, and that's going to require some review and comment. But generally speaking, what we want to do is make each of the uses defined, and then any subcategories of the uses under that. So if there is like an air transportation definition, we would want to define whatever that is, and that would include, heliport if that's something that you care about. If it's not, we can take it out. It doesn't sound like it's a big issue, but we just want to make sure everything's in there, and then we can start taking some things out. And as far as the educational institutions, generally speaking, we try to consolidate as much as we can. So if there's not a huge difference in the impacts between various types of schools, we'll lump them together. Obviously, colleges are going to be a bit different than your secondary schools and primary schools, but we can take a look at all that. That's the kind of feedback we're looking for as you review it.
Okay. I guess another one that caught my eye, and it's probably because I like antiques, but the definition of an antique is an item that's over 100 years old. And under antique shop, you said that 80% or more of the products sold would be at least 30 years old. And I guess as a person who drives pretty far to go to good antique shops, I would not want to go to a shop that had 80% of its stuff was 30 years. I mean, I consider that stuff junk.
Yeah, we can play around with that one.
Okay. I think the only other question I had, and this gets down into nitty gritty, but as you look at the zoning code for older sections of town, I happen to live in one of the designated historic areas, although we've really done nothing to enhance that definition. But I would like to look at those traditional historic areas. One of the reasons that I guess I have a particular interest is that lot lines are different than they would be in newer areas because there weren't many regulations back in the day. For me to I wanted to build a new garage, for example. For me to build a garage, I would have had to have moved it 3 feet into my yard. My yard's not that big. So instead of improving my property by building a new garage, I repaired the old garage. And instead of spending, I think, somewhere around $35,000, I'm spending less than 10 when it could have helped the neighborhood. And I know other people have done the same thing. Either they bulldozed the old garage that maybe was built to house a Model A or Model T Ford. They need a bigger garage and they can't build it. So I'd like to see us look at least in those areas, looking at building back on the original site, provided it's not encroaching on the neighbor's property or on city property, and not have to follow those other restrictions that you would have if you lived in a new section of town.
Yeah, and that can easily be done as we zone these more specific to those unique characteristics. So if you're in the TND, for example, we can do that kind of thing throughout the TND, and then it won't apply to the rest of the residential parts of the city where it might impact them. So it allows us to be much more intentional about where we would allow something like that. That's great.
Good. Mr. Haymaker.
I just have a question on fences. You say that the fence should be located where the posts and beams are towards the property itself, unless approved by both property owners that it could be the opposite, facing the property line. What if a new owner moves in? Is that grandfathered in if they put the post on the outside of the fence?
Yes, the existing condition would be lawfully conforming. Yes.
Thank you.
But let me follow up on that. If you replace the fence, then you would need to go with the new regulation, right?
That is correct.
Yep. Okay. You want to say something?
So in the case that you're talking about, say you built the fence with the structure facing out towards the neighbor agreed to that. That neighbor then sells, a new neighbor moves in. You need to replace the fence with the proposed regulations. If the new neighbor agrees to that same structure on the outside, that could be done.
Okay, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
Other questions at all? When will we hear back from you?
I refer that to Barbara. What is the next? Yeah.
Okay, Barbara, what are the next steps?
The next steps are to make this available for the public to review and comment. The one problem of many problems that we've had with COVID-19 this year is that it makes it difficult to impossible to have any kind of public forum. So we're still working out how we can take public comment, encourage the public to read, review, comment on this in a way that it's not everybody gathering in a room or something like that. So we haven't set out an exact timeline. I would think that we're probably looking at mid-January perhaps for having the next level of the draft available. My plan is to have it come before council and planning commission at least once more, if not twice more, depending on how much we need to revise based on what the public, the community, city council, planning commission have to say about the draft that we have now.
Are there other questions at all from council? Mrs. Milligan?
Thank you. In thinking about getting more public input, I think part of it will be, for me, as I was thinking about that process because of COVID, is there some sort of maybe video or something that could walk somebody through, kind of like we did tonight, but could walk somebody through the where we are in the process and the PowerPoint that somebody could pull up maybe on our website or on the sydneycode.com website that we could direct people in the community to go to and then be able to give feedback. Because my fear is that people don't know what's going on and they'll say, well, I didn't know you were doing that.
Sure. Right. That's definitely something that we're cognizant of, and we'll try and get it out there as much as possible.
Sure.
I like the idea of making a video. I mean, maybe even posting it on YouTube. And I don't know, this is recorded, but is it recorded with the screen as well as sound?
Yes. Audio and sound is recorded. So we may be able to do something with this. We'll have to, if we're going to post it anywhere online, we have to make sure it meets ADA requirements. But there's a company that does that works specifically with our website that may be able to do something for us.
But we'll definitely look at that. I like that idea.
Thank you.
I think, yeah, I do too. And I think if there was a way for them to even post questions that then we could respond to, because I think those questions might generate other questions.
Yes.
I want to go back to the Planning Commission to see if you have any follow-up questions. Mrs. Miller, any follow-up questions?
No, I don't.
Mrs. Dunn?
Actually, I'm wondering, is this the time for us to look at expanding the historic district? I mean, as we all know, most of downtown Sydney is full of gorgeous architecture, and many of the kind of titans of industry, the founders of our city lived in houses that are still existing, not necessarily just up on the hill. I mean, all the way down to Miami. I mean, you have some stunning homes that I would love to see protected. I don't know if that's the time, if now is the time to look at expanding our existing historic district, or if that's something that we need to handle at a later date. But, as the city builds, and as you see, whether it's business owners or commercial investors or, other individuals coming in to invest their dollars there, I would hate to see more of our identity being torn down. And I think that if we have a good code in place and good markers in place stating, that we do value our historic architecture, I think that, if we're setting this out to the public and we're sitting before, City Council and the Planning Commission, is it not something that's appropriate to have as part of this conversation?
You want to respond to that?
We've actually discussed that particular thing, and while definitely there's a lot of interest in having a historic district, having historic guidelines for preservation. It's different regulation, generally speaking, from the zoning code. The zoning code has a specific purpose. Historic district regulations have a different purpose. And Sean, feel free to jump in on this. I know we discussed it a little bit.
Yeah, the historic district expansion would probably necessitate a new historic inventory or potentially a historic plan. If you don't have one that's up to date, I would probably recommend doing that and identifying those exact boundaries and exact properties, and then coming back in and working on an updated historic overlay district with new boundaries and guidelines specific to those new areas.
Well, I think the two historic districts that exist were put together, my recollection is somewhere maybe in the 1970s. Does that sound right, Barbara?
Yeah.
And obviously a lot of things have changed since then. I think if we were going to try to do something that added to those two districts, it would require a great deal of investment of time, certainly, and probably dollars as well.
So it might be the good next step after the zoning code is adopted to look at historic districts, historic regulations for preservation, et cetera, as a follow-on, basically.
Well, I think certainly to get people to invest in those districts, you would need some kind of codes, because no one wants to put a lot of money into a historic house only to have the house next door to it continue to deteriorate. And, it just doesn't make financial sense. So I think that a good next step would probably make sense. Let's continue on. Mr. Gross, did you have any follow-up comments?
No.
Mr. Asher?
The only thing is, there's a lot to absorb here in the 171 pages that I'm looking at, and how it impacts the present neighborhoods and zoning areas. I need to do a lot more studying on what is being presented than to make comments at the present time.
Well, I think we've got the guidelines of where we are headed. I think if anyone on the Planning Commission has any suggestions about how to get the word out, please forward them to Barbara. I think we can try to see whether or not we can take tonight's presentation and kind of loop it together so that people who may want to get online and look at it can, and then offer their own